Let's start today with the latest Newspoll. Not a lot changing. The government's still heading for what looks like, on these numbers, minority government at the next election. I'm delighted to be joined, as I am every Newspoll, by political editor at The Australian, Simon Benson. Simon, as I say, not a huge shift, but it comes at a time when there's a fair bit of uncertainty on the security front and various other things. But the government's been driving hard on its policy when it comes to made in Australia. What's your overall read of these numbers?
Look, you're right, and good morning. It's great to be with you as always. Look, there is hardly any movement at all, and there hasn't been a lot of movement really in the polls for 6 months. I think one of the remarkable things about the polls is their stability, which says two things. Firstly, we all recall, the last election was forged, I think, out of a sort of triumph of disillusionment. Electorally speaking, Labor won on a primary vote record low. The coalition ended up with the lowest representation in its history. So I think what you could glean out of this is that baked-in pessimism is still running, and not much that either side is doing is cutting through or shifting the dial either way.
Let's look at the overall sort of helicopter view, though. Labor and Albanese still in an election-winning lead, essentially.
Look, exactly. At 51-49, it's 1 point below the last election result. That would be enough to tip them into minority government. But at the end of the day, on these numbers, Anthony Albanese would still be Prime Minister, albeit being the leader of a minority government with either the Greens or the Independents. And that is a consistent trend that is now emerging in the polls. No matter what they do, no matter what they say, it's not shifting the dial for people.
The future Made in Australia policy, though, that they've announced and they're running hard with, looks like it's quite popular.
Look, yeah, there's majority support for that. I don't think that's surprising necessarily. If you ask people, should the government be driving investment in clean energy, people say yes. There's a number of different ways you can ask that question, but I think what's interesting about it is, even though there is majority support for that policy idea, it'll obviously be judged inevitably on its delivery, but also it produced no bounce at all for Labor on its primary vote, at 1 point. But the same thing occurred during the tax cuts, if you recall, when there was a lot of money spent there for very little electoral benefit. So even though the government are talking about things that people agree with, it's not shifting people towards Labor.
And what about the contest between the two leaders? The Prime Minister, obviously, they have the advantage, the incumbent, but more, he's still the preferred Prime Minister by a fair way. But in terms of approval ratings, they're both in negative territory.
Both in negative territory, and those numbers really have been quite stable as well. Since Anthony Albanese went into negative territory mid last year and has stayed there, and a lot of that could be put down to the referendum, he hasn't really made a dent on trying to bring that up. Peter Dutton remains in negative territory. You've got two leaders in negative territory. Going back to my original sort of assessment of what those polls tell you is that there is a baked-in pessimism in the electorate. Voters aren't too thrilled by either of them.
So much comes down to cost of living. You've got the budget coming up next month. If they're going to shift the primary vote either way, because the coalition needs a 4 in front of it, of their primary to win, Labor needs to boost its primary to have a majority. What's the key to doing that either side?
Well, doing something about it, I suppose. You hear a lot about it, but I think people are smart enough to realise that there's not much being done about it. And all the lead indicators are that this is going to be prolonged. I think the government were expecting that things would be starting to improve. So you'd had a glide path to the election where interest rates were probably coming down. The economy was, you could see some growth in the future in the economy. But as we've just learned from Jim Chalmers' visit to DC, all the indicators are going south again. So I think that people realise that while both sides talk a lot about cost of living, there's not a lot being done.